Game number 5, we have the white pieces, and here we're going to look at a new opening, the English opening, pawn to c4. This is just slightly less common than e4 and d4 at high levels, but at the beginner and intermediate level, pawn to c4 is pretty rare. Almost everyone plays d4 or e4, but there's really 4 main moves in chess at the top level. It's e4, d4, c4, and knight f3. And the idea with c4 is usually white wants to play a little bit more positional. It's sort of like the Sicilian in reversed. So the Sicilian goes e4, c5. Black is putting that queen's bishop pawn up too. Well, that's what we're seeing in reverse from the white side. So the idea is, if black plays d5 later on, white wants to trade a wing pawn for a center pawn, right? The c pawn can capture that pawn on d5. So it's a good opening, usually more positional. e5, and here we see a reverse Sicilian. So it's the Sicilian with the colors reversed. So picture e5, e4, excuse me, and then c5. Same position, colors flipped. But here, white has the extra move with the Sicilian pawn. Knight c3. White's trying to control the light squares. g6. Black goes for the kingside fianchetto. d3. Bishop g7. Bishop d2. This move looks a little bit slow, but the idea is it guards the knight. Sometimes white will play queen c1 even. Maybe try to put that bishop on h6, poking at the fianchetto bishop. So there's definitely not a bad move, bishop d2. Just feels a little bit slow. Knight f6, pawn to g3. This goes nicely with this pawn structure, putting the bishop on g2, pointing queenside. And again, we're looking at the light square control in the center by white. And currently, black has control of the dark squares. Pawn d6, bishop g2. Knight to c6. And here, white does not want to take this knight right away, because we've talked about this before, but the bishop pair is very valuable. And also, when you have a fianchetto bishop on your king side, this bishop helps support the king. It makes the king safer when it gets castled. So white does not want to trade off that bishop. And also, taking this knight right away is eliminating the strongest piece on the board probably for white right now. That bishop has the full range across the diagonal, controlling these important squares. So knight f3 played, bishop to g4, natural square. There's no pin here, which is interesting to note because of the pawn on e2. And probably what black is looking at is queen d7, and maybe they play bishop h3, attacking the fianchetto bishop. So white castles, good move. Black castles, good move. Also good would be queen d7. I actually even prefer that slightly. And now rook to b1 by white. And you might be looking at rook b1 thinking, this is a strange move. But as we talked about in the Joko piano, if you're the player that knows the plans outside of your opening system, that gives you a big step up against your opponent. And one thing that we do with all the ChessGoals courses is we talk a lot about the plans, and we go into what happens in the middle game. White knows in this sort of reversed Sicilian structure, this pawn's already up on c4. Playing pawn to b4, pawn to b5 is an excellent strategy. White wants to play for the queenside expansion, and that works well with that g2 bishop going all the way across the board. Right? So white's just looking at all of these light squares, and these pawns controlling light squares, and the bishop controlling the diagonal, and this pawn wants to keep marching up the board. That's the strategy for white. So rook to b1 helps support that pawn on b4 so that it doesn't get captured. Here black plays knight to d4, and I think this already shows that black is uncomfortable in the position. So black's rating is 830, white's rating is 1235. White understands the opening, black does not. When you play a move like knight to d4, you need to already start thinking tactics. You have to calculate what's going to happen if white takes. I don't think black did a good job here calculating this out, because what happens in the game is very straightforward. Knight takes d4, opening up the attack on the b7 pawn, and you know that black is going to capture back. It's the only move. And now knight to b5. And all of a sudden there's an issue for black. Not only is this pawn attacked, but this pawn's also attacked. Black cannot defend both at the same time. And also sometimes when the bishop captures this pawn on b7, the other side can play rook to b8 and win the b2 pawn back in return. Here that's never going to happen with the rook sitting on b1. So black is dropping a pawn already, and we're only 11 moves in. c6, knight takes d4. We see that clean pawn up for white. No compensation for black. Now, just as important in chess, when it comes to how to win a game, just as important in getting that advantage is converting the advantage. And we're going to see a pretty much flawless conversion by white in this game. White knows exactly what to do. They eliminate all the counterplay, trade down. They always keep enough of an advantage that they know they can get the win. So let's just appreciate and talk through how white smoothly converts this game. Rook to e8, rook to e1. So, source of counterplay, right? Black's got a double attack here, and white says, I'm going to protect this pawn on e2 with a third piece. White's got an extra defender there, just playing ultra safe. Pawn to c5. White says, no problem. And they don't even put the knight to an aggressive square. They just bring it right back to c2. But white's also aware that black doesn't have an attack coming because they're watching all the pieces, right? They know what black's plan is. And white still wants to play with their plan of b4. Knight helps support that. Rook to b8 to defend this pawn, which is being attacked. Pawn to b4 by white. So it's not like white is sitting back and just playing defense. White's playing solid, but they're looking to push the pace when they have a chance. It's a great strategy. C takes b4, and rook takes b4. White opens up the rook, applies extra pressure on that pawn on b7, and you can just feel not only is white up the pawn, but white has the initiative still. White is dictating the action. That's very important. Pawn to a5 by black. Not a good move. Black just misses this pawn being double attacked, and white takes. So now we're looking at 2 pawns up for white. Bishop h3. And this is a little bit of counterplay, right? See how that bishop is eyeing the open square around the white king? White says, all right, I'm going to just move my bishop back, make your bishop look silly unless you want to trade. And black makes what I would consider a mistake here in terms of practical chances, and black just trades. So now all white has to make sure is black is not going to be able to attack this king easily. For example, queen a8 check is their way to react, and keep an eye on that knight. White's got it easily covered, and white had, I'm pretty sure, calculated this out. Queen a8 check. Don't play king f1, because there would be a checkmate in one move, but white's able to simply block. Pawn to f3. And even though you want to be careful moving pawns up, because it, for example, opens the e3 square, the white king is perfectly safe here. Pawn to d5 by black, trying to open up lines, maybe get this knight coming into the game somehow. White says, nope. I'm going to shut that idea down and make a passed pawn. And I have a saying in chess, passed pawns pose problems, 4 Ps in a row. This passed pawn is going to help white win the game. A passed pawn in the endgame is super strong. White knows that they can keep it defended. Knight back to d7. Back in the pawn. But now we see pawn to d4. The knight on c2 is holding this guy. Bishop on g7 was trying to attack it. And if you look at black's pieces, they're all kind of sitting back right now, right? The only piece active is probably the rook on e8, but it's attacking a pawn that's defended twice. Knight f6, and look at the pawn on f3. Guards e4, guards g4. Those are the 2 squares that knight wants to head to. So now that bishop is even more passive, and the knight's passive because all it's doing is defending. None of these pawns in the center are attacked by black. And white says, all right, I'm going to play active now. Bishop to f4, eyeing this square, right? This pawn wants to go up 2 squares soon, get up to c7. King h8 by black. I think the idea is maybe they try to reroute the knight, but it's a pretty slow plan. Queen to b1. White's now activating the queen. So notice how as soon as white doesn't need their pieces to be defensive, they look to put them on a more offensive square and start to bring more pressure against black. Knight to g8, queen to b6, eyeing this pawn and supporting the important squares for this pawn on c5. The pawn wants to keep pushing. Bishop h6. So black offers a trade, and white says, sure, I will take that. That's one less piece that you have black in terms of fighting back in this game. And it took you how many moves to coordinate that trade offer? And then in one move, white simply just takes it. On c6, Here it comes, 2 squares away, passed pawns pose problems. The main thing that white needs to calculate here is, can black pick up that pawn? So for example, rook to e6. But there's this nice resource, queen to b7, offering the queen trade. And if queen takes queen, pawn takes, the rook comes over, there's actually knight to e3, giving this up, winning this pawn, and white's still in good shape. So I don't know if white calculated all that out, but you want to make sure when you push this pawn here that you're ready for anything. And I'm looking at the computer evaluation. The computer says it's a little premature to push this pawn. It would be better to make sure that pawn is secure than to try to trade it for this one. So maybe white should have moved something different here. For example, queen back to b3, pressure this pawn on d5. But they went for it on c6. And black did not react correctly because it's very tough to figure out what to do against a passed pawn. Queen to d8 played, offering queen trade. White says, sure, I'll take. Rook c1, getting behind the pawn. Rook c8. The knight moves. So now white has a clear plan. They want c7, bring the knight in, boom, attack the rook, promote. Knight f5, knight b5. Black creates a double attack, and white says, no problem, I'll push. And now there's no way for this knight to attack that pawn again. d5 is the square, but it's blocked. Black goes f5. White says, all right, I'll attack your 5-point piece with the 3-point piece. And now it's over. Take, take. Swings that rook down to help the pawn. Queen. And white goes on to win this in just a couple moves. Look at the conversion technique. White goes and gets a queen. Very quickly gets the checkmate. All right, so what are the key takeaways here? Number one, having that planning out of the opening. This was an English opening. White knew what to do. Rook b1, pushed the b pawn. Black lost that pawn. I think it was move 11. So very early in the opening. Didn't have a plan. Let's see, what else? Remember that you don't have to capture a pawn if offered. Yeah, that's a good one. And when you're behind, try to keep the game complicated. So black's kept looking for trades, but really black should try to keep that game complicated. They made this game pretty easy on white. And then for white at the end, be careful of moving that passed pawn too quickly, right? That almost gave black a little bit of chance to fight back, but otherwise I would say this was essentially a flawless game by white. The 1200 as white played at probably a 2000 plus level. So very impressive game. All right, so that's game number 5. We saw an English opening, and I will see you guys in game number 6.